I'm not sure which is harder to write, Act 2, Part 1, or Act 2, Part 2, but they're both difficult for different reasons. But what is fabulous about working with these 4 questions for me is that I can have at least a good sense of what Act 2, Part 1 will be simply by looking at whatever, and again, go back to what you've done. So we want to pretend that we don't want to get ahead of ourselves. So whatever the character's dream is, okay, here's the fun part. In Act 2, Part 1, it is simply the nightmare. And as you can see by looking at the action, it's not just one thing. We have quite a lot of things going on. In a good movie, we're not just talking about one dream in one night, but we're talking about different aspects. So you have, what's happening in the family life, what's happening in the work life, and, what's happening in society. So we can look at these things. So in Witness, in Act 1, the dream is to be a good cop. And the first thing that happens is there's a shooting, and now there's the challenge for him to be a good cop, and he's blocked because the eyewitnesses are Amish, and they can't be handled in a traditional manner. Then he finds out that the killer of the cop is another cop, and then because the witnesses are not traditional and they can't be treated such, he's forced to actually deal with his sister and put them up there. So he has to take on a human interaction, which is something that's very important to understand. That part of his dream of being a cop is that it gives him a reason not to be involved with people. So he's already heading into the nightmare by the end of Act 1. And what gives us the nightmarish qualities in Dorothy, what happens is in The Wizard of Oz, she runs away, and she gets to see Professor Marvel, who's not yet the wizard. And Professor Marvel filches a picture of Auntie Em out of her bag and puts it under his fake crystal ball, and basically tells her that if she runs away with Toto, Auntie Em is very sick and might die. It's not quite that, but I'm going to emphasize it for my own purposes. And there is our heroine, forced to make a choice. Is she going to save her aunt or her dog? That's pretty good stuff, and all of you should aim to get there by the end of Act 1. But that's not enough, because if she just has to do that, we're going to get into Act 2, Part 1, but we're not going to get through the whole long middle. So we need a tornado. And as I said when we first started talking, the tornado in Garden State is he meets the girl. So a tornado does not have to be literally an act of God. In Witness, what happens is he realizes that his boss is corrupt, and he is almost shot. So the tornado, the Witness is the attempt on John Book's life. So now, hopefully, as you're following along, you are taking the dream that you came up with, and hopefully you've read the book and you've seen that there's a certain amount of action you have to come up with, and you have sort of a list of potential scenes, and from there you can intuit, again, 3 or more aspects of the character's life, again, family, work, and self, something like that. And now we could take those different aspects and see what the worst nightmare of the character would have. I'm sorry, that was not grammatical. What the character's worst nightmare would be. So I want you to look at page 28 of the book, and again, I'll hold it up, but it's not really going to help you. You kind of need the book to read it. We define a nightmare as a frightening dream that expresses feelings of anger, helplessness, extreme anxiety, or sorrow. Now, what's important in terms of plotting this part of the movie is to understand that nightmare is a metaphor, because we describe a horrifying event that happens to us in real life as a nightmare. And so we have to make a leap here before we go back into fiction. We have to kind of step out of our story and think about if the character were talking to us. Again, this is a complete work of imagination. This is not something that you're going to put in your screen. This is just another one of my really techniques that's extremely enjoyable to do, to actually talk to your character. It's just really fun. You'd say, okay, so here's my new character. What's a nightmare for you? And John Book would say something like, trying to drive Samuel and Rachel home after I shot was a nightmare. And there he is, he's shot, he's trying to get these people up to Amish country before he gets killed. That's a good definition. So it's useful to ask yourself, before you do this work for your screenplay, what you would define as a nightmare. Because what that allows you to do is it allows you to connect on an emotional level with yourself. And again, this is outside the scope of the seminar. This is other work, and it's a lot of the work I do in coaching, that we have to borrow from actors' craft, and we have to use ourselves as the benchmark by which we define what our characters are capable of, because, writing has to come from life. And you have no way of experiencing anything else except by being yourself. So I think that this whole trope that we hear about, putting yourself in the story, can be reinterpreted as not being literal. You don't have to literally put yourself and talk about your own nonsense, which hopefully is really boring to yourself. But rather to connect with, how would I feel if I were John Book and I had, again, his dream, and I had to drive my witness back to Amish country after I'd been shot. And that's where you have to go. And that's where 90% of the screenplays, and in general all the writing, falls down, because you have to be willing, for however many minutes you need to be willing, to be as upset as your character would be in that situation. You have to write from that place. Now again, this is not method writing. It's not a question of going out and getting yourself shot and driving a witness, or it's not a question of going to Kansas and getting yourself in a tornado. And I'm being facetious to make the point. The point is that we are all extremely human, and we all prefer not to ever confront any of the things that bother us. But writing, certainly dramatic writing, is about creating conflict. And you have to find an organic way to translate conflict onto the page. And the place you start is with yourself. And again, I want to be very clear, this does not mean that you're going to write about your own self, your life. We don't care about that. I mean, well, we may care about that, and in which case I can look forward to reading your memoir. What we care about is this idea that somehow there's a magic in creating art of any kind, which is that the emotional feelings of the artist or writer somehow make an imprint on the words themselves. And again, I'm sure there's a scientific basis, but somehow this idea that our emotional state when we're doing our artistic work influences somehow the way the words come through to the reader is not to be underestimated. And I'm not saying that if you're going to write something, you have to get yourself in the same state, but you do want to take a few moments here to connect with, when you think of what your own worst nightmare is. Again, briefly, not to put in your screenplay, but just to get connected. How is that for you? And what is your experience? And all day, as I say, I work with 3 students today, and I had a phone session with someone else. And the idea here is that what you're trying to convey, however much plot and character and exposition and whatever else you have, is you're trying to give the reader, and ultimately, hopefully with your movie, the viewer, your audience, the experience of whatever you have your character have happening to them. So in Witness, the urgency of the film comes from a multiple situation, which is that he's been betrayed by his boss, a cop has been killed by another cop, which is a complete travesty of everything he believes. He has to get the witnesses away because they are in danger of also being shot, because they can identify the killer. And then the equivalent that we talked about of this mental tornado is the fact that he himself has been shot and may not physically be able to get them to safety.